First class isn't for everyone. The words snapped through the cabin like a whip, sharp and public, as the Black family settled into their seats with a grace that only made the contempt around them more glaring. Passengers averted their eyes, some shaking their heads in quiet disapproval, while the flight attendant stood firm, arms crossed, daring them to argue. No one came to their defense. No one questioned why they were being singled out. They had the suits, the tickets, the right to be there, but not the welcome. And in a space built on luxury and privilege, that was enough to brand them outsiders. What the flight crew failed to see was that they weren't humiliating just another passenger. They were humiliating the very man whose name signed the contracts, whose ownership stretched far beyond the seats they tried to deny him. Stay tuned, because the moment of reckoning was closer than anyone on that plane could imagine. Like this video, if you believe respect should have no conditions, subscribe for more real stories, and tell us in the comments, what part of this hits you the hardest, and where are you watching from? We're listening. Marcus Robinson adjusted the cuff of his navy blue blazer as he led his wife Danielle and their young daughter Olivia through the gleaming hallways of the international terminal. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air was cool enough to make you feel alive, but not so cold as to bite. The family's steps echoed lightly off the marble floor as they made their way toward the Skylux Airlines first-class check-in counter, their matching leather luggage gliding smoothly behind them. Marcus shared a warm smile with Danielle, whose cream-colored dress and tailored coat gave her a timeless elegance, while Olivia skipped along, clutching her favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Floppy. They had planned this trip for months, a celebration of milestones and memories, a well-deserved family getaway. As they approached the polished counter, the airline agent behind the desk glanced up, her smile fading just slightly as her eyes scanned them. "Next," she said crisply, motioning with a hand that seemed almost reluctant. Marcus stepped forward, producing their gleaming passports and neatly folded first-class boarding passes with practiced ease. The agent, a woman named Carla according to her name tag, took the documents without a word. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary, her brows knitting into a small frown. "First class?" she asked, the words sharper than the situation warranted. Marcus nodded calmly. "Yes, ma'am. Booked a month ago." Carla nodded absently, but continued typing, her gaze flickering up at them, with an unspoken question hanging in the air. Moments stretched longer than they should have, and Marcus noticed the queue forming behind them. Other passengers shifted impatiently, but Carla remained focused on the screen, as if seeking a reason to object. "Could I see a confirmation email?" she asked suddenly. Danielle blinked, startled by the request. "The boarding passes should be sufficient," Marcus replied evenly, his voice calm, yet carrying the undercurrent of someone used to situations like this. Carla hesitated, then forced a tight smile. "Just a precaution, sir. We've had mix-ups before." Danielle reached into her handbag, producing her phone, scrolling quickly to the confirmation email, and handing it over. Carla barely glanced at it before nodding curtly and handing back their documents. "You're all set," she said, her tone mechanical, devoid of the warmth she had offered the couple in front of them, who had already breezed through moments earlier. Marcus offered a polite thank you and steered his family toward security, his hand lightly resting on Olivia's shoulder. As they moved away, he caught a glimpse of Carla shaking her head slightly, her mouth pressed into a thin line. The security checkpoint loomed ahead, the usual bustle of travelers organizing laptops, belts, and shoes into gray plastic bins. Marcus had navigated this countless times. He knew the drill well. He neatly placed his carry-on and shoes on the belt, setting Olivia's small backpack beside them. Danielle followed suit with her purse and tablet. They stepped forward to the body scanner. An officer, young and sharp-eyed, directed them through. Marcus passed without issue. Danielle, too. Olivia, giggling a little, skipped through behind them. But then another officer older, wearing a badge that read supervisor, approached. "Sir," he said, his voice brisk but not impolite, "we'll need to do a secondary screening on your bags." Marcus frowned slightly. "Is there an issue?" "Random selection," the man replied with a shrug that wasn't quite convincing. Marcus watched silently as they pulled aside his carry-on and Olivia's backpack, unzipping and inspecting every pocket with exaggerated thoroughness. Other passengers moved freely through the checkpoint, barely glancing at the Robinsons or perhaps deliberately not looking. Danielle squeezed Marcus's hand briefly, a silent show of support. The officer rummaged through Olivia's bag, extracting Mr. Floppy and giving it an unnecessary squeeze before handing it back with a grunt. "You're clear," he said at last, zipping the bags and sliding them back without an apology. Marcus gathered their things and led his family away without comment, though the line of tension along his jaw was visible now. They made their way through the terminal, passing sleek boutiques and bustling coffee shops. Olivia's eyes lit up at the sight of a colorful candy store, but Marcus gently urged her onward. They had a plane to catch, and delays, he knew, were seldom forgiven. At Gate A17, the Skylux Airline sign glowed in elegant silver against a backdrop of deep blue. The waiting area was already filling with passengers, many in tailored suits or designer dresses, sipping lattes and tapping away on tablets. Marcus and Danielle found seats near the front, while Olivia perched on Marcus's lap, playing quietly with Mr. Floppy. When the boarding announcement came over the intercom, first-class passengers invited to pre-board, Marcus rose, smoothing his jacket, and gathered their belongings. As they approached the gate agent, Carla's colleague, a tall man with sandy hair and a tight smile, scanned the boarding passes. His smile faltered slightly when he saw the Robinsons, but recovered quickly. "Boarding to your left," he said, his tone too neutral to be welcoming. As they stepped into the jet bridge, the change in air was immediate, cooler, more sterile. The world narrowed to the sound of their footsteps and the faint murmur of the flight crew ahead. Stepping into the cabin, Marcus inhaled the familiar scent of polished leather and expensive cologne. First class was immaculate. Wide seats upholstered in gray leather, soft golden lighting. The hush of an environment meant to whisper luxury. A flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform stood near the entrance. Her name tag read Brenda. Her welcoming smile, bright for the couple ahead of them, faded almost imperceptibly as she caught sight of Marcus and his family. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice polite but lacking any genuine warmth. She gestured vaguely toward their seats without offering to assist with their luggage, as she had done moments earlier for another family. Marcus secured their carry-ons in the overhead bin himself, then helped Olivia settle into the window seat. Danielle slid into the aisle seat next to her, leaving Marcus to take the seat across the aisle. Brenda busied herself adjusting service carts nearby, her body language closing off any opportunity for further interaction. As Marcus buckled his seatbelt, he caught the flicker of an expression on Brenda's face, discomfort, perhaps, or disapproval, quickly masked under professional composure. Danielle turned to him, her voice soft. "Maybe it's just a long day for them." Marcus smiled faintly, but his mind churned. He knew better. These small slights, these accumulated indignities, they were not new. They were as familiar as the weight of the gold watch he wore or the feel of the leather seats beneath him. As the plane filled, a subtle tension hung in the cabin air, unnoticed by most but keenly felt by the Robinsons. Marcus leaned back against the headrest, his gaze steady on the aisle ahead, bracing himself for what he already sensed would be a long flight. As Marcus Robinson adjusted Olivia's seatbelt and tucked Mr. Floppy under her arm, the first-class cabin buzzed softly with the subdued conversations of well-heeled travelers settling into their private sanctuaries for the long flight ahead. The stewardess Brenda, now stationed at the front of the cabin, busied herself with final preparations. But even from his peripheral vision, Marcus noticed how she deliberately avoided glancing their way. Danielle smiled at Olivia and began reading a story from the in-flight magazine to keep her distracted, her voice low and sweet, masking the tension simmering just beneath their carefully composed exterior. The overhead announcement soon buzzed to life, signaling the start of general boarding, and Marcus glanced at his watch instinctively. Across the sleek aisleway, he caught movement at the entrance to the first-class section. Carla, the check-in agent from earlier, now assisting with boarding, stood stiffly behind a small podium. Her eyes roved lazily over the incoming passengers, the polished facade of hospitality cracking ever so slightly as she caught sight of the Robinsons seated in the prestigious rows. As more economy passengers filed past, some sneaking envious glances at the luxurious seating, Carla leaned slightly toward her colleague, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, but low enough to feign innocence, murmuring, "Looks like someone took a wrong turn. Must have mistaken the airline." The words sliced through the air like a scalpel, sharp and deliberate. Marcus heard it clearly, and though he kept his face expressionless, he felt Danielle's hand still slightly in her lap. The whisper was calculated, meant to humiliate without confrontation, to cast doubt in the minds of the bystanders, now glancing curiously in their direction. It was not the words alone that stung, but the way they were delivered, so casually, so publicly, without consequence. Olivia, oblivious to the undertone, but sensitive to the growing tension, nestled closer against Danielle's side, clutching her bear a little tighter. Marcus inhaled slowly through his nose, exhaling with the measured patience of a man who had weathered storms far more brutal than this, but who never ceased to be wounded by their recurrence. A tall flight attendant with blonde hair and a clipboard tucked under his arm, his name tag reading Todd, strode briskly into the first-class cabin, giving brisk nods to the passengers he deemed acceptable, his smile widening for each tailored suit and pearl earring. When he reached the Robinson family's row, however, his demeanor shifted. His smile faltered, replaced by a polite grimace that barely concealed the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Olivia, now growing restless in the pre-flight lull, stood up on her seat to peer over the back at the other passengers boarding behind them. In her innocence, she laughed quietly at something she saw, a little boy carrying a backpack shaped like a dragon, and started to climb onto the armrest for a better view. Before Marcus could gently pull her back down, Todd was at their side, his voice clipped and low, but firm enough to carry across the surrounding rows. "Miss," Todd said sharply, addressing Olivia directly in a tone far sterner than necessary, "First class isn't a playground. You're in the wrong section if you're looking to jump around." Danielle's head snapped up, her mouth opening slightly in shock, while Marcus instinctively placed a steadying hand on Olivia's back to ease her down. Todd's words, seemingly masked as discipline, dripped with accusation, as though Olivia's mere movement sullied the sanctity of the leather seats and champagne glasses. Other passengers nearby lifted their heads from magazines and tablets, their gazes flickering between the Robinsons and Todd with guarded curiosity. Danielle's voice, calm but edged with steel, broke the charged silence. "She's just excited to travel," she said, a small, polite smile ghosting her lips, though her eyes were sharp as daggers. Todd gave a thin smile in return, one that failed to reach his eyes, and murmured, "Of course," before turning sharply on his heel and moving to assist another passenger, his departure a clear dismissal. Marcus felt the weight of the exchange settle over them like an invisible yoke. He glanced across the aisle at Olivia, who now sat quietly, her wide brown eyes searching his face for reassurance. Marcus leaned over slightly, brushing her curls back from her forehead, and whispered, "You're doing just fine, sweetheart. Just fine." As he sat back, Marcus caught a glimpse of another flight attendant whispering in Brenda's ear, their eyes darting toward the Robinsons before quickly looking away, as if caught in the act. The murmurs, the glances, the patronizing tone, it was a symphony of microaggressions, carefully orchestrated to remind them that, despite the expensive tickets, the luxury clothing, and the impeccable manners, they were seen as intruders in a space not meant for them. Danielle shifted in her seat, adjusting her belt unnecessarily, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as if expelling nervous energy. Olivia returned to clutching Mr. Floppy tightly against her chest, the bear's worn fabric absorbing the rising unease. Through it all, Marcus remained still, outwardly composed, but inwardly tightening like a coiled spring. Each slight, each dismissive glance another turn of the screw. In the cabin, the hum of boarding announcements continued, a soothing background noise that barely masked the underlying current of tension flowing steadily their way. More passengers passed through the aisle, some with sympathetic smiles, others with carefully neutral faces, most pretending not to notice anything at all. As the final groups boarded and the cabin doors prepared to close, Brenda began her safety announcements, her voice smooth and professional. but even that felt colder, more mechanical when directed at their row. As the plane shuddered slightly, preparing for pushback, Marcus reclined marginally in his seat, his eyes trained on the back of the seat ahead, his mind turning over the possibilities. This wasn't over. Not even close. The plane continued its low mechanical hum as the last passengers shuffled past the first-class section and into the rear cabins, the overhead bins clicking shut one by one as flight attendants made their final rounds to secure the cabin for takeoff. Marcus adjusted his seatbelt, the thick leather strap fitting snugly across his chest, and glanced toward Olivia, who sat curled in her seat with Mr. Floppy tucked protectively under her arm, her small hands nervously twisting the edge of her travel blanket. Danielle leaned over to brush a stray curl from Olivia's forehead, offering her daughter a smile that was both comforting and forced, as though trying to wrap her in warmth strong enough to withstand the chill of their surroundings. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft amber glow that should have been soothing, yet Marcus could feel the prickling undercurrent of discomfort building steadily around them. Brenda, the lead flight attendant, moved gracefully from row to row, greeting passengers with polished professionalism, her voice dipping into a honey tone reserved for the well-dressed businessmen and the diamond-clad socialites. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Jensen. So good to see you again," she cooed to a portly man slipping into C2A. "Lovely to have you back with us, Mrs. Lancaster," she chirped to a woman 2 rows ahead, helping her stow an oversized handbag with a smile so wide it could have been painted on. But when Brenda's path finally brought her to the Robinsons' row, her demeanor shifted imperceptibly, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a flicker of something colder in her eyes. She did not extend a hand to assist with their bags, did not offer a greeting, did not even meet their eyes. Instead, she paused briefly, as if ticking off an invisible box on a checklist, then pivoted away without a word, her heels clicking briskly on the carpeted aisle. Marcus watched her go, his face betraying nothing, but Danielle stiffened slightly beside him, her lips pressing into a firm line. Olivia, sensing her mother's unease though not fully understanding its cause, nestled deeper into her seat. Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath barely audible over the murmur of the cabin, and glanced around, noting how attentively Brenda and the other attendants fussed over the other passengers, offering them drinks, adjusting pillows, laughing softly at their jokes. The contrast was glaring, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. As the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing the expected flight time, Marcus tried to refocus, to let the slight roll off his back the way he had been forced to do so many times before. But as the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, a small incident shattered whatever fragile peace he had managed to construct. Olivia, bored and restless in the lull before takeoff, reached into the seat pocket in front of her and pulled out a small pouch of crayons that Danielle had packed to keep her entertained. She giggled quietly to herself as she arranged them on the tray table, lining up the bright colors in a careful row. But as the plane jolted slightly over a seam in the tarmac, the crayons slipped from her grasp, scattering with a clatter onto the floor and rolling under the seats in every direction. It was a harmless accident, the kind of thing that happens on every flight with young children, usually met with chuckles or indulgent smiles from fellow passengers. But before Marcus could even lean down to help her retrieve them, Brenda materialized at their row, her face taut with irritation, her voice cutting sharply through the ambient hum. "This is not a playground," she barked, her tone loud enough to draw startled glances from several nearby passengers. "Keep your belongings secured. This is first class, not a daycare." Olivia froze, her small hands clutching the edge of the tray table, her eyes wide and round with confusion and fear. Danielle's cheeks flushed a deep crimson, a mixture of anger and humiliation, but she bit down hard on her response, choosing instead to crouch down silently and begin gathering the fallen crayons. Marcus stayed seated, his body rigid, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He knew, he knew all too well, that reacting would only play into the narrative already forming in Brenda's mind, and perhaps the minds of others who had heard her scolding. React, and he would be labeled difficult. Stay silent, and he would be labeled weak. The familiar no-win scenario wrapped itself around his chest like a vice. As Danielle collected the last of the crayons and returned to her seat, she whispered soft reassurances to Olivia, who blinked rapidly as if holding back tears. Brenda stood there for a moment longer, her arms crossed, her mouth set in a tight, disapproving line, before turning on her heel and stalking away without so much as a word of apology. The humiliation hung heavy in the air, thick and inescapable. Marcus turned his gaze to the window, the bright runway lights blurring into elongated smears against the darkening sky as the plane gained speed, the engines roaring louder, pushing them forward, upward. Yet inside, Marcus felt only the sinking weight of gravity, dragging him deeper into the seat, deeper into a suffocating reality that no altitude could escape. As the plane lifted off and the city shrank beneath them, the world outside seemed vast and limitless, but within the narrow confines of the first-class cabin, the Robinsons' world had become smaller, colder, more hostile. Brenda resumed her rounds, her smile once again re-emerging for the right passengers, her laughter ringing false but accepted. Olivia leaned into Danielle's side, burying her face in her mother's arm, and Danielle smoothed her daughter's hair with trembling fingers, whispering soothing nonsense into her ear. Marcus sat rigid, staring straight ahead, every muscle in his body taut with suppressed emotion. The message had been delivered loud and clear. You are not welcome here. The aircraft had reached its cruising altitude now, a soft chime signaling that passengers could move about the cabin. The lights dimmed further, bathing the first-class section in a warm, golden glow that should have felt intimate and relaxing, but only seemed to deepen the Robinsons' sense of alienation. Olivia had finally settled down, tucked securely between Danielle and Marcus, her eyelids fluttering in the early stages of sleep. Mr. Floppy still clutched tightly to her chest. Danielle shifted slightly, reaching for a blanket tucked into the side compartment, draping it carefully over Olivia's small form. Meanwhile, Marcus leaned back against his headrest, his eyes open but unfocused, staring at the overhead lights as the quiet murmur of the cabin washed over him. Around them, other passengers had begun to receive their meals, trays laden with carefully plated dishes, silver covers lifted with a flourish to reveal artfully arranged entrees steaming with fresh warmth. Brenda, moving with the polished grace of a seasoned flight attendant, delivered each tray with a practiced smile, exchanging light jokes and warm conversation with the other first-class guests, her voice dropping into a lower, more intimate tone when speaking with the businessmen in tailored suits and the women adorned with gleaming jewelry. Marcus observed all of this with a detached sort of clarity, every movement, every inflection catalogued and analyzed in the back of his mind. When Brenda finally approached their row, the mask of hospitality she wore for others slipped, her expression shifting into one of brisk efficiency. Without the usual fanfare, she deposited 3 trays onto the Robinsons' table stands, her motion swift, mechanical, almost resentful. Dinner service, she announced curtly, not addressing them by name as she had others, not asking if they preferred the chicken or the fish, not offering an accompanying glass of wine or a recommendation from the dessert list. Marcus thanked her anyway, his voice calm, measured, giving her no reason to escalate whatever private grievance she seemed to harbor. He lifted the silver lid covering his tray and immediately noted the difference. His food, supposedly a herb-roasted chicken breast with seasonal vegetables, sat lukewarm, the edges of the meat dry and curling slightly, the vegetables limp and unappetizing. Across the aisle, Marcus saw another passenger lifting the cover from his tray to reveal a plate glistening with freshness, the steam rising visibly into the cool cabin air. Danielle's meal was no better. Her pasta congealed into a sticky mass, the sauce separated into oily pools along the edges of the plate. Even Olivia's children's meal, which was supposed to include freshly baked bread and warm pasta, appeared sad and neglected, the bread stiff and the pasta clumped into a cold mound. Marcus glanced instinctively at the other trays in the cabin, hot meals beautifully arranged, accompanied by cheerful chatter and attentive refills of sparkling water or wine. Here, at their row, there was only silence, the heavy, suffocating kind that screamed volumes without a word being spoken. Danielle picked up her fork, poking lightly at her pasta, her appetite clearly diminished. Olivia, still too sleepy to notice the difference, simply pushed her food around the tray absent-mindedly, her little fingers toying with the fork more out of habit than hunger. Marcus set his utensils down quietly, his stomach churning with a bitter mixture of anger and sadness, not from hunger, but from the clarity of the insult served alongside the food. Brenda reappeared moments later, her tray balanced neatly against her hip, gliding from row to row offering wine pairings and dessert options to the other passengers, her voice lilting and charming, a hostess at a five-star restaurant. But when she stopped by the Robinsons, there was a beat of hesitation, a microsecond of deliberation before she forced a smile that barely touched her lips. "If you're not comfortable," she said in a tone dripping with false concern, "there's always the option to transfer to the main cabin. Sometimes it's less formal there, more relaxed." Her words hung in the air, light as a feather, but sharp as a blade. Marcus locked eyes with her for a moment, a long, steady gaze that spoke of all the battles he had fought to be sitting in that very seat, of all the times he had swallowed indignities far greater than this and risen higher regardless. Danielle stiffened beside him, her hand clenching the armrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. But she said nothing, understanding instinctively the delicate dance they were forced into. Olivia, sensing the tension, looked up with wide, questioning eyes. But Marcus leaned over and smoothed her hair with a gentle hand, his movements slow and deliberate. "We're quite comfortable where we are," he said finally, his voice calm, almost pleasant, the kind of voice that concealed an ocean of simmering fury under a glassy surface. Brenda held his gaze a moment longer, something flickering in her expression, perhaps defiance, perhaps the first stirrings of unease, before she nodded briskly and moved away, her heels clicking sharply against the carpet. Around them, the first-class cabin returned to its insulated bubble of privilege and pretense, the clinking of silverware and the muted laughter of the other passengers resuming as though nothing at all had happened. But for Marcus, Danielle, and Olivia, the warmth of the cabin had been stripped away, replaced by a chill that no blanket could fend off. Marcus picked up his fork again, forcing himself to cut a piece of the dried chicken, his movements mechanical, detached, because giving into anger would only justify the story Brenda and others like her wanted to believe about them. He ate not because he was hungry, but because dignity demanded it, because sitting tall and refusing to be shamed was the only act of resistance left to him in a space designed to deny him his humanity. Danielle mirrored him, lifting her fork and twirling the congealed pasta with an elegance that belied the pitiful meal before her, while Olivia nibbled at a corner of her bread, blissfully unaware of the battle raging silently across the tray tables. The clatter of carts resumed, the faint clinking of glasses and soft music playing through the overhead speakers. But for the Robinsons, the world had narrowed to the small, silent space they occupied, a fragile island in a sea of silent judgment. As Brenda disappeared into the galley once more, Marcus leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes closed for a moment, gathering his composure as the plane sailed steady and unbending across the vast, indifferent night sky. The hum of the engines provided a constant backdrop to the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over Marcus and his family. Danielle busied herself with Olivia, who had finally dozed off against her mother's side, one small hand clutching a corner of her blanket. Marcus sat motionless, his mind a turbulent whirl of restrained anger and wearied resignation, his body taut with the effort of maintaining an outward calm. The first-class cabin bustled quietly around them, the clink of glassware, the occasional muted laughter, the rustling of newspapers, an elegant, genteel world from which they remained conspicuously isolated. Just as Marcus reached for his water glass, seeking a momentary distraction, he noticed Brenda approaching once again, a clipboard tucked under her arm and a tight, unnatural smile plastered across her face. She paused beside his seat, her presence casting a shadow over the small pool of light from his reading lamp. "Mr. Robinson," she began, her voice low but firm, the words slicing cleanly through the cabin's soft ambience. "As part of our commitment to maintaining a comfortable environment for all our guests, I'm going to need you to review and sign this document." She extended the clipboard toward him with both hands, the paper clipped to it bearing the unmistakable bold heading, Passenger Code of Conduct Acknowledgement. Marcus frowned slightly, his eyes scanning the dense text, noting phrases like ensure non-disruptive behavior, cooperate fully with crew instructions, and acknowledge that refusal may result in removal from flight. It was a document designed to intimidate, not inform, and its presentation, targeted solely at him and his family, left no doubt about the underlying message. Around him, other passengers sipped their champagne and nibbled at fine chocolates, blissfully unaware or willfully indifferent to the humiliation unfolding at row 3. No one else had been asked to sign anything. No other passenger had been approached with such thinly veiled suspicion. Marcus set his water glass down carefully, his movements deliberate, and met Brenda's gaze with a steadiness that spoke volumes. "Is this standard practice for first-class passengers?" he asked quietly, his voice so controlled that it drew a subtle flinch from Brenda. She hesitated, her professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "It's not typical," she admitted, but given the earlier disruptions, her voice trailed off, the accusation left unspoken but hanging heavy between them. Danielle straightened in her seat, her mouth opening as if to object, but Marcus placed a calming hand on her knee under the tray table, a silent plea for patience. He knew the game being played, knew the traps laid carefully at his feet, and he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him stumble. Wordlessly, he accepted the clipboard, scanning the document one more time before signing his name with a steady hand. He handed it back to Brenda, who murmured a perfunctory "thank you" before retreating down the aisle, her shoulders stiff, her pace brisk. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his eyes half-lidded, his mind seething behind his calm exterior. Danielle turned to him, her voice low and taut with fury. "This is outrageous," she whispered. Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly but said nothing, his jaw set, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Around them, the cabin carried on, oblivious or uncaring, the brief disturbance swallowed by the cozy cocoon of privilege that enveloped every other passenger except them. A few minutes later, as the dinner trays were cleared away and the soft glow of the cabin lights dimmed further to signal the onset of nighttime service, Marcus pressed the call button above his seat. A small chime sounded, and within moments, Todd appeared, his expression a parody of courtesy, his hands folded neatly behind his back. "How can I assist you, sir?" he asked, the sir dripping with insincerity. Marcus kept his tone even. "I'd like a glass of orange juice, please." Todd raised an eyebrow, the smirk playing at the corner of his mouth barely concealed. He leaned in slightly, his voice pitched low but carrying an unmistakable edge. "First-class service usually prioritizes champagne, sir," he said, his tone saccharine with mock deference. "We do aim to cater to a more refined palate." The implication was clear. You don't belong here, and your preferences betray it. Marcus met Todd's gaze without flinching, his own eyes cool and unblinking. "Orange juice," he repeated simply, each syllable enunciated with quiet authority. For a moment, Todd hesitated, as though weighing whether to push further, but something in Marcus's expression, or perhaps the sheer weight of his composure, caused him to think better of it. He nodded stiffly and turned on his heel, disappearing toward the galley. Danielle exhaled slowly beside him, her fists clenched in her lap. "The nerve of him," she murmured under her breath. "They're treating us like we're intruders." Marcus nodded, his face a mask of calm, though inside he could feel the slow, steady burn of outrage gathering strength. Olivia stirred slightly in her sleep, shifting closer to Danielle, and Marcus softened instantly, reaching across to tuck the blanket more securely around his daughter. He would endure this, for her, for Danielle, for the principles he had spent his entire life upholding in the face of adversity. A few minutes later, Todd returned, setting a small plastic cup of orange juice down on Marcus's tray with a flourish that bordered on theatrical, as if presenting an exotic, distasteful artifact. He offered no further words, merely a thin-lipped smile before retreating once again. Marcus picked up the cup carefully, taking a small sip, the cool citrus taste sharp on his tongue, a fleeting moment of normalcy in a sea of indignities. He set the cup down with precision, his mind already shifting gears, preparing for whatever next slight might come their way. The cabin settled into a deeper quiet. Passengers reclined with plush blankets and ambient lighting mimicking the soft hues of a setting sun. From the galley came the faint clatter of trays and silverware, the muffled voices of flight attendants exchanging pleasantries meant only for the favored few. Marcus leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes briefly, but sleep remained a distant impossibility, chased away by the relentless awareness that here, even surrounded by luxury, they remained outsiders, unwanted guests in a world that refused to see their worth beyond the color of their skin. The engines roared steadily outside, a sound that once symbolized adventure and ambition to Marcus, but now merely underscored the endless, exhausting journey of proving oneself over and over again. Somewhere ahead in the cabin, a bell chimed softly as another passenger summoned a flight attendant, laughter drifting faintly back toward them like echoes from a distant shore. Marcus opened his eyes again, the weight of the cabin pressing down on him, as he prepared for whatever indignity awaited them next. The soft hum of the engines remained steady as the hours crawled by, and the warm, artificial glow of the first-class cabin seemed to dim just slightly, though Marcus suspected it was only his perception shifting under the heavy weight of accumulated indignities. Danielle sat rigidly in her seat, her hand gently stroking Olivia's curls, as the little girl dozed fitfully against her side. Marcus tried to focus on the small mercies, the calm breath of his daughter, the quiet solidarity in his wife's touch. But even these were marred by the sharp edge of vigilance that refused to let him truly relax. The cabin had settled into a fragile peace, broken only by the occasional clatter from the galley or the murmur of a conversation drifting from another row. Marcus was reaching for his water glass again when Olivia stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes with small fists. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse with sleep, "I need to use the bathroom." Danielle nodded, smoothing Olivia's sweater and helping her out of the seat. Marcus rose too, intending to walk with them, but Danielle gave a small shake of her head, her eyes saying what her voice would not. Let her have this little independence, let her feel normal, if only for a moment. Reluctantly, Marcus sat back, watching as Olivia made her way carefully down the aisle toward the lavatory, her small figure dwarfed by the polished expanse of the cabin. She reached the door, tiny fingers barely managing to twist the latch, and disappeared inside. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the door, his posture tense. A few minutes passed, barely enough time for a child to manage in such cramped quarters, when Brenda appeared from the galley, her expression pinched with impatience. She strode purposefully toward the lavatory and, without hesitation, rapped sharply on the door. "Let's move it along," she barked loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "You're not the only one on this plane, little girl." Marcus felt the breath catch painfully in his chest, and Danielle's hand gripped the armrest so hard it creaked. Heads turned, curious glances flickering toward the source of the commotion. Olivia's small, startled voice floated back from behind the door. "I'm sorry, almost done." Brenda huffed audibly, crossing her arms as she stood sentry-like outside the door, radiating disapproval. When Olivia finally emerged, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, Brenda stepped aside with an exaggerated sigh, muttering under her breath, "First class doesn't mean first come, first serve." Olivia scurried back to her seat, her small hands trembling slightly as she climbed into Danielle's waiting arms. Marcus sat perfectly still, every muscle in his body taut with the effort of restraint, his mind racing, cataloging, absorbing every slight like blows in a battle he was forced to endure without raising a shield. He smoothed Olivia's hair back from her face, whispered soft words of comfort into her ear, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, all while feeling the searing sting of helplessness lodge itself deeper into his chest. The silence that followed was brittle, stretched thin as glass. For a few moments, it seemed as though the worst had passed, that perhaps they could endure the remainder of the flight in uneasy peace. But Marcus should have known better. Trouble, once stirred, rarely settles quietly. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement at the front of the cabin. Brenda had reappeared, this time accompanied by a tall, stocky man in a dark suit and polished shoes. The Platinum member, Marcus, realized grimly, the gleaming badge on his carry-on announcing his status like a military decoration. They exchanged a few whispered words, furtive glances directed pointedly at the Robinsons' row. Marcus saw Todd join the huddle, nodding in agreement to whatever was being said, before Brenda straightened, smoothing her skirt, and approached. Her smile was brittle, stretched thin over the bones of condescension, her tone falsely apologetic. Mr. and Mrs. Robinson, she began, addressing them with a practiced politeness that only made the insult sharper. I'm afraid there's been a slight misunderstanding regarding seating assignments. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Oh, he said evenly. Brenda clasped her hands before her voice syrupy. Mr. Whitaker, she gestured discreetly toward the Platinum member hovering a few feet away, is one of our most valued loyalty members. Due to an internal error, he was not initially assigned the seat he requested. We're asking for your cooperation in allowing him to occupy these seats. We can, of course, reaccommodate you elsewhere in first class, or even provide you with extra amenities in business class to make up for the inconvenience. Danielle stiffened beside him, her mouth parting in disbelief, but Marcus spoke first, his voice calm, razor-sharp. Our tickets are for these seats, paid in full, reserved months in advance. Are you suggesting that our reservation is less valid than his loyalty points? Brenda's smile faltered for a microsecond before snapping back into place. Of course not, sir, she said smoothly, but we do hope our guests understand that flexibility ensures a pleasant experience for all. Marcus inhaled slowly through his nose, holding the breath, weighing the options in the space of a heartbeat. Around them, the cabin had quieted subtly, the other passengers keenly aware of the unfolding drama, but pretending to be absorbed in their screens and novels. Olivia clutched Danielle's hand, her wide eyes darting between her parents and the stern flight attendant. Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar bitterness coat his tongue. And if we decline? He asked, voice still maddeningly polite. Brenda's smile froze into something brittle. We would of course honor your reservation, she said, though the threat lingered unspoken between the syllables. Marcus exchanged a glance with Danielle, whose face was pale but resolute. Finally, he nodded once, tightly. We'll move, he said, each word landing like a stone in his gut. Brenda's smile widened, victorious, as she gestured for Todd to assist them. The flight attendant appeared moments later with a pair of new boarding cards, still marked first class, but seats much closer to the galley, nearer the noise, the cramped bustle of service carts, and foot traffic. It was a demotion dressed as a favor. Marcus rose first, gathering Olivia into his arms, the small girl clinging tightly to his neck as he led his family down the aisle in silence, the weight of countless stairs pressing against his back with every step. The move was swift, but the sting lingered. Marcus walked a short distance down the aisle with measured steps, Olivia clinging to him tightly, Danielle beside them, her face an impassive mask barely concealing the storm beneath. They settled into the reassigned seats near the galley, the noise and bustle of the crew's activity making it impossible to find the quiet they had paid dearly for. Marcus adjusted Olivia's blanket, brushing a tender hand across her curls as she drifted back into a restless sleep. Danielle sat rigidly upright, her eyes staring fixedly ahead, unblinking, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. The murmur of conversation resumed behind them, but now the Robinsons were no longer a part of it. They had been effectively exiled within the luxury they had rightfully claimed. Marcus sat back slowly, feeling the full weight of the humiliation settle on his shoulders like a lead cloak, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, with the calm precision of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of measured responses, he reached up and pressed the call button above his seat. The small chime was polite, almost insignificant, but it sliced through the cabin's hum with surprising clarity. Moments later, Brenda appeared, her smile brittle and overpracticed, her posture still stiff with the self-satisfaction of a minor victory. "Yes, Mr. Robinson?" she said, her tone dripping with forced civility. Marcus met her gaze squarely, his voice as smooth and unbothered as freshly laid stone. "I'd like to speak with the cabin service director, please," he said, each word articulated with a calm precision that brokered no room for misunderstanding. Brenda's smile faltered for the briefest second before she caught herself, masking the crack with another saccharine curve of her lips. "Is there something I can assist you with instead?" she offered, clearly reluctant to escalate. Marcus simply repeated, "I'd like to confirm some rights associated with my ticket, and possibly with yours as well." The phrasing, polite but layered with an undeniable edge, hung heavy in the air between them. Brenda stiffened visibly but nodded, biting back whatever retort had sprung to her mind. She turned on her heel and disappeared down the aisle toward the galley. Marcus sat back, resting one arm lightly across the back of Danielle's seat, his other hand draped casually over his knee, the very image of a man entirely in control, radiating a serene authority that made the surrounding clatter seem distant and irrelevant. Danielle turned to him slightly, a questioning look flickering in her eyes, but Marcus offered only the smallest, most imperceptible shake of his head, silently assuring her that now was the time for patience, not fire. Several minutes passed, each one thick with anticipation, before a new figure appeared at the front of the first-class cabin. He was a man of medium height, dressed in a dark gray suit sharp enough to signal his rank, his badge gleaming against the lapel. His face, however, betrayed a different story, the carefully controlled expression of someone who had just realized they were standing on the wrong side of a very dangerous line. His name tag read Andrew Keller, Director of In-Flight Services. Keller approached quickly, smoothing his jacket reflexively, his forehead already sheened with a thin layer of sweat despite the cabin's perfectly regulated climate. He stopped just short of Marcus's seat, offering a smile that trembled slightly at the corners. "Mr. Robinson," he said, voice pitched low and deferential, "I understand you've requested a meeting." Marcus inclined his head slightly, not rising from his seat, maintaining the position of quiet dominance he had claimed with that one simple call. "Yes," he said, his tone conversational, almost lazy. "There seems to be some confusion regarding the rights and privileges associated with my travel arrangements." Keller swallowed visibly, his atoms apple-bobbing once. "Sir, I believe," he began, but then hesitated, as if rethinking his approach mid-sentence. He glanced quickly around the cabin, noting the curious eyes that had turned toward the unexpected drama unfolding in the previously insulated first-class section. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "If you'll allow me a moment of discretion, sir, I believe it's important that I clarify something immediately." Marcus remained silent, allowing the man to continue. Keller straightened, drawing a deep breath, and then, with the reluctant weight of a man confessing his sins at gunpoint, spoke aloud for all to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed cabin, "please allow me to introduce Mr. Marcus Robinson." There was a pause, a slight shuffling of seats as passengers turned their heads, sensing the shift in atmosphere, but not yet comprehending its magnitude. Keller continued, his voice growing stronger now, fueled by the desperate need to correct an error that could not be undone. "Mr. Robinson is the chairman and chief executive officer of Skylux Airlines," he said, the words tumbling out like a confession, "and the majority shareholder, controlling 62% of our corporate stock, representing a valuation exceeding $700 million. For a moment, there was silence, so profound that even the steady roar of the engines seemed muted. Brenda, who had been hovering nearby, turned a sickly shade of gray, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish pulled from water. Todd, still arranging glasses at the front of the cabin, froze mid-movement, his face draining of color. Marcus sat perfectly still, his expression composed, but his eyes gleamed with a cold fire that needed no words to be understood. Around them, the first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some averting their eyes, others staring openly, their earlier indifference replaced now with awkward recognition. Danielle's hand slipped into his under the tray table, squeezing once, firmly, a silent affirmation of shared vindication. Olivia stirred slightly but remained asleep, blissfully unaware that her father had just shaken the foundations of an entire cabin, and perhaps the entire airline. Keller cleared his throat nervously, glancing at Marcus for direction. But Marcus offered none. He merely inclined his head a fraction, allowing the gravity of the revelation to sink in deeper, to spread through the cabin like a shock wave rippling outward in ever-widening circles. The silence that followed Keller's announcement stretched thin across the cabin, brittle and cracking under the weight of stunned disbelief. For a few precious seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, the revelation hanging in the air heavier than the pressurized atmosphere outside the plane. Brenda stood rooted to the spot, her professional polish crumbling rapidly, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. Todd, still frozen at the galley, seemed to shrink into himself, suddenly far less assured than he had been when doling out his condescension and thinly veiled disdain. Marcus remained seated, still calm, still silent, his presence now magnified by the truth unveiled. He didn't need to gloat, didn't need to raise his voice or issue demands. The simple fact of who he was and what he represented had already done the work for him. Andrew Keller cleared his throat again, a dry rasp that barely masked his discomfort, and shifted his stance. His voice, when it finally emerged, was formal, carefully measured, as though each word had been weighed and considered before being allowed to leave his mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began again, his eyes flicking briefly toward Marcus as if seeking tacit approval. "I must further clarify that today's flight was selected for an internal quality control evaluation, conducted personally and anonymously by our executive leadership team." A ripple moved through the cabin, a low murmur of surprise and confusion as passengers processed the enormity of what was happening. "This assessment," Keller continued, his posture stiff, "was intended to ensure that our first-class service standards are being upheld consistently, without bias or lapse in professionalism." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle, before adding, his voice dipping into something almost apologetic. "Regrettably, based on what has transpired here today, it is clear that we have failed that evaluation in every measurable way." Brenda's face went ashen, the blood draining visibly from her cheeks, while Todd leaned heavily against the galley counter, his earlier arrogance crumbling like sand beneath a rising tide. The other passengers, many of whom had either witnessed or chosen to ignore the mistreatment of the Robinsons, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding Marcus's steady, unflinching gaze. Keller turned fully toward Marcus now, addressing him directly with the solemnity one might reserve for a formal apology before a tribunal. "Mr. Robinson," he said, bowing his head slightly, "on behalf of Skylux Airlines, I offer my deepest apologies for the unacceptable service you and your family have received today." Marcus inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, but said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch long enough to underscore the severity of the moment. Keller cleared his throat once more, visibly gathering his courage before addressing the wider cabin again. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice rising slightly, "all crew members involved in today's incidents will be relieved of duty pending a full review. They will be removed from this flight upon arrival." Gasps echoed softly through the first-class section, a few sharp intakes of breath from passengers who realized they were witnessing the professional execution of an entire crew for their bias and misconduct. Brenda's mouth opened in silent protest, her hands fluttering helplessly as if reaching for words that would not come. Todd sagged against the wall, his face a pale mask of defeat. Neither of them dared to argue, dared to protest the verdict handed down not by an angry customer, but by the very hand that controlled the fate of the airline itself. Danielle exhaled slowly, the tension easing slightly from her shoulders, though her eyes remained sharp, watchful, protective of the small bundle of innocence sleeping quietly against her side. Marcus sat still, regal in his restraint, understanding fully the power he wielded and choosing, as always, to exercise it with dignity rather than vengeance. The cabin crew that remained, the ones who had not participated in the earlier mistreatment, began moving quietly, discreetly, preparing for the reassignment of duties once they reached their destination. One attendant, a younger woman who had observed the events with increasing discomfort but had not spoken up, now approached the Robinsons' row with a tray of fresh beverages. her hands trembling slightly as she set down glasses of water and orange juice without being asked. Her face burned with silent shame as she murmured, "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Marcus met her gaze for a moment, offering a nod of acknowledgement, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of her attempt to make right what had been so thoroughly broken. Keller remained nearby, clearly unwilling to retreat until he was certain that the immediate crisis had been contained. His phone buzzed quietly at his hip, and he glanced down quickly, grimacing before tucking it away without responding. The corporate machinery was already in motion, Marcus knew. The legal department drafting statements, the PR team scrambling to prepare for the inevitable media fallout, the board of directors being briefed on the disaster unfolding 30,000 feet above the earth. But here, in the narrow confines of the first-class cabin, where luxury had once been used as a weapon to exclude and humiliate, a reckoning had come swiftly and decisively. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, reaching for his water and taking a slow, deliberate sip. Around him, the energy of the cabin had changed irrevocably. The deference once reserved for superficial markers of wealth or status, now redirected by the raw gravity of true power revealed. Passengers who had earlier cast wary or judgmental glances now looked down into their laps, avoiding eye contact, suddenly aware of how fragile their own veneers of privilege truly were. Keller spoke again, his voice softer this time, but carrying the weight of genuine contrition. "Sir," he said, "please know that corrective actions will not end with this flight. We will be implementing a comprehensive review of all first-class service training protocols, beginning immediately. Bias, discrimination, and disrespect have no place at Skylux Airlines." Marcus nodded once more, allowing the man the dignity of completing his penance, but offering no further absolution. Some mistakes could not be washed away with apologies or policy changes. They would linger, imprinted forever on the collective memory of those who had witnessed them. Brenda and Todd remained motionless, their faces pale and drawn, awaiting the grim inevitability of what would come when the wheels of the plane touched the tarmac. The atmosphere aboard the plane remained thick with an uneasy quiet, a silence more deafening than any turbulence could ever be. As Skylux Airlines representative Andrew Keller excused himself briefly to coordinate the immediate fallout of the disaster that had played out so publicly in the first-class cabin. Marcus sat composed, one hand loosely resting on the armrest, while his other gently brushed Olivia's curls as she slept peacefully, oblivious to the seismic shifts taking place around her. Danielle leaned back against the seat, her posture relaxing only slightly, her hand resting protectively over Olivia's tiny shoulder, a silent vow that no matter what the world threw at them, their unity would never break. At the front of the cabin, Brenda and Todd remained rooted near the galley, pale and stricken, whispering frantically to one another in a hushed panic that only served to highlight their desperation. Their uniforms, once symbols of their authority and privilege, now hung on them like ill-fitting costumes, exposing rather than concealing their fall from grace. They were not alone in their downfall. Carla, the gate agent who had planted the first seeds of suspicion back at the terminal, was also being pulled into the reckoning, her name mentioned tersely over the crew's secure communication channel as Keller coordinated with ground staff at the arrival gate. Carla Henderson, Brenda Sims, and Todd Whitman are to be suspended immediately upon landing. Keller's voice had carried across the crackling intercom meant for crew only, but Marcus had heard it clearly, the steel in the man's tone leaving no room for ambiguity. Internal investigation pending. Bias violation per section 6.2 of the Skylux Conduct and Ethics Charter. The formal terminology did little to soften the blow. It was a corporate death sentence for any who bore the shame of it. Across the first-class section, passengers who had once quietly tolerated or even participated in the Robinsons' mistreatment now sat stiffly, their faces studiously neutral, as if distancing themselves from the guilt they had been complicit in by their silence. None dared meet Marcus's gaze now. The plane's gentle descent began, a subtle shift in the cabin pressure accompanied by the familiar chime, signaling the final approach procedures. Flight attendants, those not implicated, moved quickly and efficiently, securing the cabin, their faces set in tight, professional lines, betraying no hint of the turmoil crackling beneath the surface. Brenda and Todd busied themselves with mechanical motions, stowing carts and securing galley doors, every step marked by a sense of futility, as though they knew their efforts were no longer in service of a future with the airline. As the wheels kissed the tarmac with a smooth, controlled bounce, a visible shudder passed through Todd's body, while Brenda closed her eyes for a long, slow blink, as if steeling herself for the inevitable. Taxiing to the gate took only minutes, but to those awaiting judgment, it must have felt like an eternity. Marcus, for his part, remained silent, dignified, allowing the gears of justice to turn without needing to push them himself. When the plane came to a complete stop, the seatbelt signs extinguished with a soft chime, and the cabin doors opened with a hiss of pressurized air. A group of uniformed security and airline officials stood waiting at the jet bridge, their posture unmistakably purposeful. Andrew Keller reappeared at the head of the cabin, flanked by two senior human resources officers, all wearing grim expressions that brooked no argument. One by one, Brenda, Todd, and Carla were called forward, each summoned by name with chilling formality. Todd stumbled slightly as he rose, his face bloodless, sweat beading on his forehead. Brenda's legs seemed reluctant to move, but pride, or perhaps stubbornness, carried her forward in small, mechanical steps. Carla, brought up from the gate area separately, arrived with wide, glassy eyes, clutching her ID badge like a lifeline. "You are hereby suspended without pay, pending the results of a full internal review," one of the HR officers intoned, her voice crisp, emotionless, rehearsed. "You are required to relinquish your credentials immediately and report to headquarters within 72 hours for formal proceedings." The passengers, most still seated, watched the spectacle unfold with a mixture of horror, fascination, and guilty satisfaction. Not a single hand was raised in protest for the disgraced crew members. Not a single word of defense was spoken. It was, Marcus reflected silently, the truest testament to the cowardice of prejudice, that it stood tall when unchallenged, but crumbled into dust the moment light was shone upon it. As Brenda, Todd, and Carla were led off the aircraft, heads bowed, Marcus turned his attention back to Olivia, who had begun to stir slightly at the commotion. He smiled down at her, a soft, reassuring curve of his lips, shielding her from the ugliness even as justice played out around them. Meanwhile, outside the plane, the storm had only begun. Within an hour of touchdown, Skylux Airlines' official social media accounts posted a terse but powerful statement. Effective immediately, Skylux Airlines is initiating a comprehensive restructuring of our customer service operations. We are reaffirming our commitment to equality and respect in all interactions, implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, and revising our first-class service policies to ensure the highest standard of professionalism and dignity for every passenger, without exception. The press release was picked up by every major news outlet within minutes. The headline splashed across screens from coast to coast. Skylux Airlines CEO exposes discrimination on own flight. Sweeping changes announced. Keller, now visibly exhausted but resolute, approached Marcus's row once more, bending slightly at the waist in a gesture of profound respect. "Mr. Robinson," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable undertone of humility, "please know that what happened today will not be forgotten, nor will it be tolerated. You have my word and the board's word that Skylux will be better for this." Marcus regarded him for a moment, the weight of centuries of similar promises heavy in the balance, but he saw in Keller's eyes a sincerity rarely found in such moments. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Words were not necessary. The truth had already been spoken, and actions would tell the rest of the story. Around them, the cabin stirred, passengers gathering their belongings, the flight crew assisting with polite efficiency, the rhythm of disembarkation resuming at last. Yet the echoes of what had transpired lingered in every glance, every whispered conversation, every cautious smile directed toward the Robinson family, who had endured more in a few short hours than most would face in a lifetime. The days following the fateful flight rippled outward like waves on a still pond, each concentric circle carrying news of Skylux Airlines reckoning farther into the public consciousness. The Robinsons returned home to a quiet storm of media requests and corporate apologies, which Marcus largely ignored, preferring to let actions, not headlines, define the legacy of what had transpired. True change, he knew, was not measured by statements or press releases, but by the difficult, often unseen work that followed. Several weeks later, a discreet, unmarked envelope arrived at the Robinson residence, addressed by hand to Marcus Robinson. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slightly shaky, but neat. Marcus opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper within. It was a letter, written in blue ink, the words flowing unevenly across the page in a mixture of careful printing and cursive. "Dear Mr. Robinson," it began, "I am writing this letter not because I was asked to, nor because I hope to salvage my position at Skylux, but because I owe you and your family a sincere apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable. I allowed my biases, those I was barely conscious of, to dictate my behavior, and in doing so, I failed you, my profession, and myself. There are no excuses, only regret and a commitment to be better. I have resigned my position at Skylux and have enrolled as a full-time volunteer with Wings of Hope, an organization dedicated to supporting underrepresented youth who dream of careers in aviation. I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I can dedicate my future to ensuring that fewer barriers stand in the way of children who, like your daughter Olivia, deserve every opportunity this world can offer. I wish you and your family every happiness. Sincerely, Brenda Sims." Marcus read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and set it aside, his expression unreadable. He said nothing at first, but Danielle, who had watched him silently from across the room, saw the subtle easing of tension in his shoulders and understood. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. In the months that followed, Skylux Airlines moved swiftly, not just out of fear of further scandal, but because, under Marcus's steady hand as CEO, they were determined to build something better, something lasting. Carla Henderson, who had initially resisted the gravity of her actions, underwent her own transformation. After 6 months of suspension and mandatory counseling, she chose to enroll in a prestigious program specializing in cultural competency and diversity management. It was a grueling course, requiring her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and the systems she had upheld through ignorance or indifference. She persevered, graduating at the top of her class, and returned to Skylux not as a gate agent, but as the newly appointed Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Training. Her first act in her new role was to overhaul the company's onboarding process, integrating mandatory, ongoing diversity education for every employee, from the newest recruit to the most senior executive. In one of her first training sessions, Carla stood before a group of fresh-faced new hires, her voice steady but sincere as she recounted her own failures and the painful lessons she had learned. "Change doesn't happen because we hope for it," she told them. "It happens because we demand it of ourselves every day in every action." Under her leadership, Skylux introduced a series of scholarships and mentorship programs aimed at nurturing young talent from marginalized communities, with a particular focus on aviation careers. Wings of Hope, the nonprofit organization Brenda had joined, expanded their partnership with Skylux, offering internships, grants, and flight school sponsorships to students who might otherwise never have seen a cockpit except from the back of an economy seat. At the Robinson household, life returned to a new kind of normal. Olivia grew taller, her curls bouncing as she chased dreams bigger than any one flight could contain. She still clutched Mr. Floppy sometimes when she slept, but now he sat proudly on her bookshelf, a quiet sentinel to the battles fought and won. Marcus continued his work quietly, steering Skylux through turbulent skies into a new era defined not by profit margins alone, but by purpose, integrity, and genuine inclusivity. On a warm spring afternoon, nearly a year after that fateful flight, Skylux held a special ceremony at their corporate headquarters, unveiling a new wing of their pilot training academy dedicated to diversity and named the Robinson Aviation Center for Excellence. Marcus attended with Danielle and Olivia by his side, their presence a living testament to resilience, to dignity, and to the unshakable belief that the arc of the moral universe, while long, bends ever so surely toward justice. As he stood before the assembled crowd, executives, trainees, flight crews, and families, Marcus spoke briefly but powerfully. "Real change," he said, his voice resonating through the open-air courtyard, "is not about grand gestures made once and forgotten. It's about the choices we make every day, the respect we show in every interaction, the humility we practice in every seat, every gate, every flight. It's about understanding that every passenger carries a story, every colleague carries a burden, and every opportunity to choose kindness is a chance to change the world." The crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation, not for the titles or the wealth or the prestige, but for the simple, undeniable truth that had taken flight that day. In the gleam of 1,000 polished wings reflecting the afternoon sun, a new chapter had begun, one not marred by prejudice or fear, but lifted by the steady, unbreakable wings of hope. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of dignity, fairness, and change, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future stories that matter. We would love to hear from you. Which moment in today's story stood out to you the most? Was it the quiet strength of Marcus, the final moment of justice, or the unexpected transformations? And where in the world are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one.